Welcome to Season 6 of Purposeful Empathy, a show dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who believe the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. Today's episode is brought to you by Grand Huron International, an on-demand coaching provider for individuals and companies. Thanks for watching. Enjoy the show. Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today, I am joined by the one and only Andrea Goulet, who is a sought-after keynote speaker for conferences around the world and the author of the upcoming book, Empathy-Driven Software Development. She's a co-founder of two consulting firms, Core Gabytes, which modernizes legacy systems, and Heartware, which helps organizations embed empathy into their culture, communication practices, and code bases. You can recognize her by her JavaScript tattoo on her wrist and learn more about her work at empathyintech.com. Welcome to the show, Andrea.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited because I am a technophobe, and just the idea that you can bring empathy into technology is really inspiring to me, because I think user-friendly technology means that the people who developed it were empathic, and that's what you want to do, right? That's what you want to help create. So why does empathy matter when it comes to building software?
Yeah, so I think, when we think about what empathy is, right, first of all, nailing down a definition is like nailing Jello to the wall, because there's so many different opinions. But the definition that I use is that it's an interconnected set of skills that helps us understand and help people. And the idea is that there's a sense of compassion, there's pro-social. And so when we are able to work collaboratively, we're able to get things done. We're able to, like you said, build better products. But I think also there's a societal and kind of systemic piece at play here, where empathy embodies so many different skill sets. It's not one thing. I think that's the biggest thing, is that people think that empathy is just a feeling, like just have empathy, right? And really, it's about setting boundaries. It's about communicating effectively. It's about understanding your cognitive bias. It's about understanding ethics and how that, impacts things. It's about attunement and how do you verify that your assumptions that you're making about people are accurate. So in the work that I'm doing, I'm trying to really deconstruct empathy in a way that makes sense to people who code on a daily basis. So then that way they can not only build better products that are user facing, but they can create code bases that are easier to work with, right? Their daily lives will be better. And I think sometimes the way that empathy is presented to people who are more analytical or logical, it's just like, well, why does it matter? Well, it makes your life a lot better, right? It makes your life easier. And then it can also have really positive reaching effects with your interpersonal relationships, with systems, including the code, and your communities, and the world at large, your corporations. But the key is applying it skillfully, because empathy can go wrong just as much as it can go right. So, kind of understanding the nuance there is where I'm enjoying geeking out and kind of teaching people who code.
So, you just mentioned a whole host of specific skills under the umbrella of empathic capacities. So you obviously believe empathy can be trained, and that's what you want to do. But how did you come to discover empathy in the first place in the work that you did? Because you don't actually come from tech to start with. Is there a backstory?
Yeah, there's definitely a backstory. Movie maybe coming at some point. So I have a degree in marketing business communications. I spent the first decade of my career focusing on content specifically for consulting firms and building web content, and just really enjoyed the act of getting to know someone and really understanding how, because I think marketing a lot of times, it's a bridge between somebody who really needs a service and then somebody who provides that service. And when you approach it with a lot of integrity and kind of have a service-based attitude, it can be really rewarding. And that's what I really enjoyed. And then at my 10-year high school reunion, I had a good friend of mine, his name's Scott, and he had been reading my blog and came up to me and said, I started a software company. I want to specialize in modernizing legacy code. And I can't figure out how to launch the business or get clients. And every time that I do a Google search on how to do some of these things, it's your blog that comes up. So he said he didn't have money to pay me a salary, but that he would give me half the company if I came on board as the CEO. And, I was working at a large corporation at the time, so it was kind of a side hustle for a little while. But then we went full time and I was the CEO for 10 years. And in the process, Scott and I also fell in love and then got married. Now we have a family, and it's very interesting. I'm very glad I went to that reunion. And in that, we were working on why is software so hard to maintain. And what I noticed, because I had spent so much time training empathy and really using empathy, but then also teaching, Fortune 100 organizations how to apply this in their marketing communications, I saw so clearly that it was lacking in the writing of code. And I think because I had such a fresh perspective, I wasn't really jaded. I didn't come from this is just the way that the industry works. I was like, hey, software industry, your industry is very different from everything else that I've ever worked with. And I think a lot of it is that there's just a lot of contempt. And so as somebody who was self-taught and just learning to code, I would go to, for example, there's a site called Stack Overflow, where that's where you go to get questions answered. And I found at the time that just there was this attitude of, well, duh, of course you need to know that, and just was not very welcoming at all. And so contempt is the feeling of superiority over someone else. And that was something that I bumped into a lot. I would ask a question and, not necessarily Scott, but, it felt really intimidating and vulnerable. And I wanted to quit because I didn't like being treated that way. And so then I remember reading research from Brene Brown about how empathy is the antidote to shame. And so just in my tour of the software industry and meeting with so many engineers, I realized that underneath that contempt is shame, right? Shame is the universal feeling of feeling like you don't belong. And so many people were bullied or, made fun of because they liked computers, and they felt safe in environments where they could be themselves. And they put out, kind of signals that if you don't conform to this stereotype, then, that's going to kind of hurt our environment. And none of this, I think, was conscious, right? We all form kind of social groups, and we all send signals as a way to, indicate belonging. So there's no blame, but just recognizing that there was a lot of hurt, and diving into the history of it. And a lot of times, we look at comics like Dilbert, for example, where it's like you're treated as a ticket taker. And this was very real. This was a lived experience of, and the frustration that I kept hearing was the way that, kind of soft, in air quotes, skills are presented is just have more empathy. Just do this thing. It comes so naturally. And what I got was I'm somebody who needs to understand the process. Like, what is this thing? Help me understand it in a very concrete way. How does it work? Because that's what great engineers do, is they dive into the details. And I found that was part of my own imposter syndrome, because I was like, I don't know, I'm not smart enough, right? Like I tend to live more naturally in the emotional realm. So it was a real challenge for me too. But the other thing was, how do I connect empathy to my daily work? right? Like empathy makes sense if you're a therapist or if you're a teacher, but I'm a back-end software engineer. Like, why does this matter? Exactly. So then really connecting it to, if you spend time in the code base really applying empathy, then you're going to have less meetings. You're going to have more focused time. You're going to get along with your colleagues better. You're going to push more code into production, and being able to kind of list out all these benefits. And then they started to see the link.
So one of the ways that you teach software developers about empathy is through what you call the empathy system architecture. Can you tell us about that and why you think it's effective?
Yeah. So empathy system architecture is the name that I'm giving to all of the different elements. Like there's a set of 12 skills that I've identified. And I can go through them in a bit, but the idea is that people who work on software, like the code is just one piece, right, of software. Software is a system, and we call how that system is constructed software system architecture. And as I was starting to learn more about what empathy is, and as I was reading through the research of what the skill sets are, and really starting to understand that it's not just one thing, it's an interconnected set of skills that helps you increase your capacity. I just saw such a strong link between the different facets that we need to comprise a successful software architecture. So if you want to have an application, like Zoom, we're using Zoom, right? Like there is a system architecture for that software, right? How does it, how do you host it so that computers can see it? How do you structure the data? Like the user facing interface is just one piece of that. And so, people who are, in software, there's what's called the front end engineer, which focuses on kind of what's in front of the screen. So things that the user sees. And then there's a back end engineer. So they work on all of things that typically you don't see. So the database and networking and the source code and all of these different things. And it's an abstract concept, but I think it really works, because when we position empathy as an interconnected system, then we can focus on resilience, because what you want is a software system that's really resilient. You want it to be responsive to change. Like that's the mark of a healthy code base. And that's the piece that I learned from working at Corgi Bytes. For gosh, it's been almost 13 years now. But, in learning, what does a healthy code base look like? A healthy code base means that you can get changes into the cloud or you can get changes into production really quickly. It's not brittle. It's not going to collapse because of one event. It's really easy to work with. And so, kind of seeing that, and then also looking at empathy is about resilience. It's about the resilience of relationships, right? It's about the resilience of, social systems. And it's about the resilience within ourselves too. Like, do we have the energetic capacity to actually listen to someone? So, kind of the work that I've been doing as a way to kind of structure the book is, there are definitely more skills, but I figured 12 was kind of a kind of good limit. So some examples would be like sensing, right? The way that we, take information in from the world and then convert it into electrical impulses that our brains can work with. That's like a computer's input, right? Like that, we take physical energy, like typing on a keyboard, and then we turn it into electrical signals so the computer can process it. And so similar, we've got perception, right? And that's processing. Communication, that's output. So how do we express ourselves verbally and non-verbally? We have artifacts. So that's like storage, right? Like if we had this meeting and we didn't record it, it would be very ephemeral. It would just kind of go off into the ether. But because we're recording it, it's durable. And so that links things across time and space. People can recall this information and access it later. Boundaries, super critical. I think the biggest surprise in all of this is just how important boundaries are. And in the software space too, there's been a huge shift in cybersecurity from impenetrability as a strategy to resilience as a strategy. And the biggest key there is good boundaries, just like with empathy. We have relationships. And so we want to strengthen some relationships and weaken others, right? And that's the same as what we call telephony. So it's the network topology. So how do we look at nodes and connections, and how do we arrange the networks so that it's going to be as successful as possible? We have attunement, which is like synchronization. So that's how do we ensure that information is going back and forth and that it's accurate on both sides. Decisions are like algorithms, right? So we rely on patterns and, that are kind of pre-built so that it's less energy for us. Perspective taking. In software, we use database schemas, and we also have schema theory in psychology. So we construct these mental models, both to understand the code bases and to understand people. Ethics are like empathy frameworks. So they are ways for us to predetermine heuristics and rubrics so that we can act with empathy quickly. Compassion is the power source. I think one of the big things too was like, what's the difference between empathy and compassion? And for me, I want to dive in and get like really precise. And kind of the way that I'm absorbing the data is that it's very, very hard to have genuine empathy if you don't have compassion, because, compassion is that fuel. It's that desire to really help someone. And then the pro-social action is acting on that desire. So when all of these components are kind of all working together, that's what arises to effective empathy. And the idea too is that, in a software system architecture, you're never going to have all of this stuff perfect. There's always something to work on. And, you can, like, there are some people where it's like the perspective taking is really hard, right? There's a condition called alexithymia, where naming emotions is so hard, right? But at the same time, you can focus on attunement, where it's, did I understand you correctly, right? And a great character for that, I think, is Data on Star Trek, right? And The Next Generation, where it's like, he doesn't necessarily immediately infer what people are thinking, but he constantly asks questions. He's curious. And like, what was that about? And we can use that skill. And even if you struggle with the inference part of empathy, that doesn't mean that you're not empathetic. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of the idea, is that there's a whole suite of skill sets, and you can spend your entire lifetime digging into any one of these on a very deep level, just like you can with software.
Today's episode was brought to you by Grand Huron International, an on-demand coaching provider for individuals and companies. Well, at the beginning of what you were just sharing, you used a story of, the front-end engineer and the back-end engineer. And I'm imagining that, in a contempt type environment where the culture is contemptible, contemptuous.
Has a lot of contempt.
Yeah. That they would be kind of coding to compete, or coding on purpose to make it not compatible. And I guess I'm asking the question, are you sensing that there's now like a pathway in whether it's software development or whether the world at large, where there's now an interest in collaborating because we want to have the common goal of resilience and empathy? Like, are you sensing something happening at a social level?
Well, I think some of it is like, we need to have empathy for the people who feel this way, right? And people feel contempt, and they, blame and shame other people because they're hurting, right? And I think one of the biggest things was diving into the history of software. Like, how did we even get here? Like, why is this industry so different? And a big piece is that hero culture was there from the very beginning, right? So in the 1950s, there's a great essay by John Bacchus, who developed Fortran. And he wrote this essay called, software, I think it was programming in the 1950s, programming in America in the 1950s. And he says flat out, like, it was about how much liquor you could hold. Great ideas were simply were whoever spoke them the loudest, and we never gave credit to our sources. Like, so, okay, that's a hero culture, right? Like you are like that from the beginning. That is the culture that, defined software. Well, as software scaled, then in the 1960s, in order to kind of maintain that cult hero status, right, which we now see with like 10x engineers, ninjas, and right, that hero culture has never gone away. They're kind of created two different classes of developers. So there were scientific developers, and then there were what do they call it, like the business, developers, or those systems developers. And another big piece was that the biggest way and kind of the only way to get into the software industry from the 1960s through the 1980s was to pass aptitude tests. So the biggest one was called the IBM Programmer Aptitude Test. And these were time tests, 60-ish math questions, right? And you just got to get them right? Pass them really fast. So if you can't do this, then you can't become a programmer. There were also surveys that were incorporated into that said flat out, like in the recommendations, one of the top attributes of successful software developers is that they don't like people. And our recommendation is anybody who has ever worked in business should never become a software developer. And so that gets baked in. And so it's just confirmation bias upon confirmation bias upon confirmation bias. And then in the 1980s, you get a flood of pop culture where, people like me, I grew up in the 80s, and like I saw, if you're interested in computers, you look like this. And so I'm very good at programming. I'm great with like pattern recognition and all of these different things that you need, but I checked out, and it was more cultural than anything else. So I think that things are starting to turn around, but what we end up having is people who are still, scarred from the past. And, there are many engineers that I've worked with who kind of worked more in like the 70s and 80s. And they were told flat out, you may not ever help a coworker. If you talk to somebody else on this project, you will be fired. And it's like, but I want to help people. And it's like, no, that's not your job. Your job is to write this piece of code, and that's it. So I think this is important to look at the systemic issues at play rather than blaming the people who are caught up in the system. And that's why I think framing these things as systemic challenges, then we can actually start to detangle things, and we can start to shift blame, and we can say, okay, what worked in the past? What do we want to let go of? What are your strengths? What are my strengths? How can we connect with each other? How can I learn more about you in a way that I kind of understand? How am I, messing up, right? Where, I'm hitting your buttons. And how can we create a strong enough relationship that's built on trust, where we can hold up mirrors for each other and that we can grow together? And we can look at the people that we're coding for, not as objects, but as humans. So one of the quotes that I say in my presentations that gets tweeted a lot is that, in software, a lot of people were taught that the perspective that you take is of what's called the compiler, which is you've got your source code, does it run, right? And if it works, yay, right? If it doesn't, you got more work. And so the idea is like, think about the compiler. Does the compiler work, right? And you're taught to visualize these things. You're taught perspective taking. You're just taught it for an object. And so we don't code for the compiler. That's an important step, but we code for people. Communication is at the root of all coding activity. You can't differentiate really between most programming languages these days. There are definitely they're based on ones and zeros. But in languages that use a compiler, we're using natural language. So, saying it's all the same thing. And whether or not we're looking at the words that are on the screen that the people on the other side are going to read, or whether or not we're looking at words that are in the source code that yourself 10 months from now is going to read when you've forgotten, like, what did I write? Or somebody who comes after you, who's going to be the steward of the code that you wrote. Or, kind of something goes haywire and it's like, well, that was not an intended effect. Let me change my code as quickly as I can. But it enables us to be nimble and make good decisions and all work together. But there absolutely is a culture of fear. There's a culture of territorialism, and there's a culture of urgency. And when you get all of those things, you are encouraging the people within that system to withhold information, to be secretive, and to have a lot of ego. And that's where we are. But we can change that. And I think I'm starting to see, like, in the newer generation, like people who are just graduating from college, it's like, well, yeah, all the products in, like, okay, I have a degree in biology, but of course I'm going to code, right? Like, I've been giving lectures at colleges, and it's like, how many people here think they're technical or non-technical? I gave this in your class and people were like, what? What are you even talking about? That question seems bizarre. And that's encouraging to me, I think.
Yeah, I'm struck by how the work that you're doing is to actually, I'm afraid even to use these words, but let's call it like the universe of words, where people who are in this space can actually have a sense of healing and a sense of joy and a sense of, I don't know, what came to mind is what you were saying towards the very end is some research that Frans de Waal has done. He's a primatologist in the Netherlands. Yep. And he talks about, 50 years or so of research into chimpanzee culture has given us this assumption that we're like competitive and hierarchical and violent by nature, and that's the way the human condition is. And he's like, well, I've studied bonobo culture, and they're collaborative and compassionate and nurturing and loving by nature. And they literally make love, not war, when they're in little clan fights. And when I discovered that there's humans have more DNA in common with chimps and more DNA in common with bonobos than they have with each other, that to me was a light bulb moment. Because I do believe...
Wait, let me make sure I understand that. So humans have... Can you repeat that?
Yeah.
So, because the way I heard that was that humans, two different humans...
No.
So, okay.
Imagine me, and then there's a chimpanzee over here and a bonobo over here. Yes. So I have more DNA in common with the chimp and more DNA in common with the bonobo than they have with each other.
They have with each other. Gotcha. They have with each other. I was like, then other humans? Thank you for pausing. And that was an act of empathy, because it's like, I felt confident enough to be like, I'm on the podcast and I understand what you're talking about. Right. And I think that's an example of vulnerability, but it's like, let me check this information. Am I understanding this correctly? And I think that's the goal that we want. We want to get to things in real
100%, because a viewer is grateful that you've asked for that to be repeated and unpacked, so they understand it too. So thank you. But isn't that kind of mind blowing? I found when I discovered that was kind of mind blowing. And the story that's told in our culture is pretty much the chimpanzee story of humans. Mm-hmm. And what you're describing in terms of the origin story of software development sounds very chimp story. And you're saying hey, there's this other way of being where we all benefit. And why wouldn't we want to be there, right? So thank you so much for all the work you're doing. I have one question that I love asking my guests at the end of the podcast. And that is, can you think of a time when you were on the receiving end of empathy and what that meant for you?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, there have been so many times. The one that I think sticks out the most is, I think this is Brene Brown, but the idea of clarity is kindness. And that I know Kim Scott has done a lot of work with her work on radical candor, where if you don't challenge people directly, then you wind up in what she calls ruinous empathy, where you're caring a lot, but you're really not demonstrating empathy because you're just you're not growing together. So for me, there was a moment where Scott and I had been running the business together for a few years, and he got on our very first podcast, and it was super exciting. And so we were on our way to his grandmother's house, and we were like, let's listen to the podcast. So at the end, the host asks about the origin story. And so Scott tells the, story about us getting together at high school reunion. And he said, I'm the technical founder and Andrea is the non-technical founder. She's great with sales and marketing, and she really sets up operations, and she's learning how to code. But that I didn't hear all of the good stuff that he said. All I heard was the word non-technical. And I turned to him, and like my eyes were feeling hot, like just, it felt really offensive. And I asked him, I said, I have been coding next to you for 4 years. When am I going to be technical in your eyes? When am I going to be good enough for you? When am I going to belong in this industry that just I have struggled? And I feel like such an outlier because I go to conferences and no one looks like me. No one thinks like me. When I would go to conferences, people would ask that question flat out. Are you technical or non-technical? And it's like, do you know how hard it is to be in an environment where people ask you explicitly, do you even belong? And so Scott's very calm and patient. So he kind of listened and let me process my feelings. And then he said, I called you non-technical because that's how you describe yourself. We were in a sales meeting right before I recorded that podcast. And I remember listening to how you positioned us. And I tried to mirror the words that you used to describe yourself. So when you start calling yourself technical, so will I. And identity crisis in not a light way. But I think that was such an act of empathy because he didn't get defensive. He said exactly why, but he held up a mirror and said, these are the concepts that you've got in your brain. This is how you've constructed your identity. And it's up to you to change it. And I'm going to follow your lead. And yeah, so that kind of started the whole journey of like, well, what am I? And I'm just very grateful because that's what led me to where I am. And I think that's why I'm on such a mission now. Like I started paying attention, almost like when you get a new car and then you recognize like, oh my gosh, all these other people, like I started noticing how many times I was calling myself non-technical or diminishing my value or saying, oh, well, I don't really understand the math, so I'm not that important. I don't have that much to contribute. And I just felt very safe on the very emotional side. I felt like, oh, I don't have anything. I'm not a logical person. I'm recognizing like, no, I can grow those skills just as much as other people can grow their empathy skills. And if I learn to, develop more skills around how to process information in a more analytical way, how to spot logical fallacies, how to use less absolute language and more precise language, like that's going to help build that bridge. And so that's what I've really worked on for the past decade. And then other people want to build that bridge too, but sometimes it does take, you taking that first leap of faith outside of your comfort zone. And I'm so glad that Scott gave me a little push.
Bravo to Scott.
Yes.
Little props to Scott. Now, Andrea, this is the moment where I would hold up a book from an author. So we'll just, have the space in our mind. Empathy-driven software development is going to come out soon. People can go to your website, empathyandtech.com, to learn more about you. Get on your mailing list for your podcast and for your newsletter and eventually to order the book. Thank you so much for sharing part of your day. Your work is fantastic. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy. What if you had access to your own council of coaches to help you break free from your thinking clutter, make that important decision, and liberate you from whatever's holding you back? At Grand Huron International, you get to choose the coach of your choice anytime from anywhere. Visit grandhuroninternational.com and harness the power of on-demand coaching today.